joining us for today's masterclass titled Viking Voyages Part 2 The Eastern Road, led by Dr. Irina-Maria Manea. Firstly, what is SASA? SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. Our mission is to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past. Building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship, we work towards our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. You can find us on all major social media platforms by just looking up Save Ancient Studies. A few housekeeping rules. Please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions throughout the event. Please be patient with technology and those administering it. SASA live events are live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook, and the recordings are archived on those platforms. And most importantly, have fun. If you enjoy our events, please consider becoming a supporter of SASA with a recurring monthly donation. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us save ancient studies. Thank you for joining us again. I'll now hand it over to Irina.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here again. And today we actually have, in my opinion, a more interesting topic than last time when I talked about Vikings in the North Atlantic. Today we're going to be traveling east. I apologize for my terrible voice. Unfortunately, I am sick, so bear with me throughout this presentation, and I'm sure you're going to find out a lot of fascinating things about the travels of Vikings in the East. Sorry, just a little bit of a technical glitch. My pictures won't load. Yep. All right. Eastern silver is something that is going to be very relevant in our story because we can talk about a so-called silver rush in the 9th century, and this can be noticed in all the regions where Vikings had something to do. Eastern silver, primarily in the form of Islamic silver coins known as dirhams, they had a significant, sometimes indirect influence on Viking Age territories such as England. The discovery of dirhams in England, even single finds in rural areas like Derbyshire, demonstrates that Vikings in England were part of a much larger network that extended far beyond Western Europe. These coins served as a tangible proof of contact and trade with the powerful Islamic Caliphate and the trading routes that formed part of the Silk Roads. This challenges pretty much the traditional view that Western Viking activity was largely separate from Eastern trade routes. Numismatic evidence makes it clear that around the year 800, the roads to the east were largely open, and this is due to the prosperity of the Abbasid Caliphate, first and foremost, with the city of Baghdad being founded in 762. The first Islamic coins reached the Viking town of Birka in Sweden and the Danish town of Ribe around 786. And now let's see what the Vikings were actually doing in the east. And let's start with the Baltic Sea. Now, we do have the author Snorri, the Icelandic author, with his writings on the history of the Norwegian kings, has a saga called the Ynglinga Saga, the first of his great cycle of stories, where he speaks of Swedish and other northern kings raiding in the Baltic not long after the death of the Uppland king, known as Adils, and the semi-legendary Danish king Hrolf Kraki. He also mentions a guy called Ivar Vidfamni, Ivar the far traveled or the far reacher, who is actually a character noticeable on on a lot of runestones in Sweden. And it is said that he won for himself a large part of Sweden, Denmark, Northumbria, Germany, and the entire Austerrike, the eastern realms. And this is actually a very disputed term. We don't really know what Snorri meant by it, but what we can infer from what he's telling us is that there were these semi-legendary chieftains who chose to travel east as well. In another source, in Rimbert's Vita Ansgari, he documents the conversion that Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, was involved in, written in about 870. He records of the Kurlanders, or the Kuronians, the Kori, and they had been subject to the Swedes in earlier times, and despite the fact that they defeated a Danish invasion in 850, a Swedish force led by King Olof, who was the king of Birka at the time, turned their fortress of Seeburg to the ground and then received their surrender, but also the surrender of a second town known as Apulia. Now, archaeological research here has brought evidence of Swedish and Gotlandic presence as well, the island of Gotland, which was quite close to Latvia. And we have the archaeological site of Grobin, or Grobina, which is very relevant to our story. It is just a few kilometers east of Libau, Liepaja. The old settlement is actually in many ways comparable to the great Viking towns of Hedeby and Birka. It was surrounded by earthwork and protected on three sides by the river Alanda. There are also three adjacent cemeteries here of considerable size. Some of the graves are for men from central Sweden, buried with their weapons and covered with mounds. Others are the graves of people from Gotland, or at least connected somehow to Gotland. And then we have a very interesting connection to Estonia. This is mainly thanks to the excavations going on here in 2010 and the years to come. We have the Salme ship burial discovered here, one of the earliest known examples of Scandinavian ship burials, and it provides insight into Viking Age customs as well. And it is also a piece of evidence in this whole story about the beginnings of the Viking Age, because usually you read in textbooks that the Viking Age began in the West with the famous raid on Lindisfarne. Well, the problem would have been a little more complicated than that. People wouldn't have just woken up one day saying we are Vikings. It was a gradual process, and apparently this process also started in the East, and it actually might have started a little bit earlier in the East. So this burial site comprises two ships dating back to the 8th century. That would predate the attack on Lindisfarne. And the ships contained the remains of high-ranking warriors, as well as an array of rich grave goods, including weapons, ornaments, and tools, suggesting a violent end for the men buried here. The burial involved ships typical of early Viking seafaring craftsmanship, and the placement of the warriors and grave goods within the ship reflects a ceremonial importance tied to both maritime culture and warrior identity. The remains show clear signs of violent injuries, hinting at a death in battle, possibly during a raid or a conflict. The grave goods, including imported items, indicate the wealth and far-reaching trade connections of these individuals, and this whole story reflects an elite class with access to international trade routes even in this early period. The burials also underscore the importance of ships, not only physically but also symbolically, as vessels for travel and conquest, as well as carriers in the afterlife. Now, we cannot speak of the Vikings in the East without resorting to a very problematic yet necessary source, the Russian primary chronicle, or as it is also called, the Tale of Bygone Years, Povest Vremelny Let. Now, this story details the calling of the Varangians. Varangian is a term used for Scandinavians in this part of the world. I'll come back to that in a jiffy. At any rate, Scandinavians, according to this particular source, would have been called to organize some sort of political entities during the reign of Emperor Michael, give or take. During the reign of Emperor Michael, they attacked Constantinople, as a matter of fact. So the chronicle states that 4 tribes who had been forced to pay tribute to the Vikings, to the Varangians, and they're named here the Chuds, the Slavs, the Marians, and the Krivicians. They drove the Varangians back beyond the sea, refused to pay them further tribute, and set out to govern themselves. But there was no law among them, and tribe rose against tribe. Discord ensued among them, and they began to war against one another. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to custom." Thus they went overseas to the Varangians, or to the Rus. These particular Varangians were known as the Rus, just as some are called Swedes, other Normans and Angles, and still other Scotlanders, for they were thus named. The Chuds, the Slavs, the Krivicians, and the Ves then said to the Rus, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come reign as princes. Come rule over us." Three brothers with their kinfolk were selected. They brought with them the Rus and migrated. The oldest, Rurik, located himself in Novgorod, the second, Sineus, in Belozero, and the third, Truvor, in Izborsk. From these Varangians, the Russian land received its name. Says the Chronicle, everything here is quoted from the Chronicle. Thus, those who live in Novgorod are descended from the Varangian tribe, but earlier they were Slavs. Within 2 years, Sineus and his brother Truvor died. Rurik gathered sole authority into his own hands, parceling out cities to his own men, Polotsk to one, Rostov to another, and to another Belozero. The Varangians in these cities are colonists, but the first settlers in Novgorod were Slavs, in Polotsk Krivicians, in Belozero Ves, in Rostov Merians, and in Murom Muromians. Rurik had dominion over all these folk. Two of Rurik's men, by the name of Askold and Dir, were not of his tribe but were warriors, and they sought permission to go to Tsarigrad, to Constantinople, with their tribe. They thus sailed down the Dnieper, and in the course of their journey, they saw a small city on the hill. They asked, "Whose town is this?" The inhabitants answered, "There were three brothers, Ki, Shrek, and Koriv, who built this burg, but they have since died. We who are their descendants dwell here and pay tribute to the Khazars." Askold and Dir remained in the city, and after gathering together many Varangians, they established dominion over the country of the Polyanians. Rurik ruled in Novgorod. So this is the kind of information you get from the Russian primary chronicle. A lot of names and a lot of places. Some are attested archaeologically as well. It is noteworthy to say that the story that is presented very, very coherently was written a couple of centuries after these facts would have occurred, and it also had quite a clear ideological purpose, which was to legitimize the rulership of the descendants of Rurik. The chronicle continues by stating that their principality was seized and they themselves killed. I mean, here Askold and Dir, and this happened by Rurik's successor at Novgorod by the name of Oleg, and the chronicle also says that this Oleg set himself up as a prince in Kiev and declared that it should be the mother of all the Rus cities. The Varangian Slavs and others who accompanied him were called thus Rus, and Oleg began to build stockaded towns and imposed tribute on all of these tribes, Slavs, Krivicians, Merians, and so on. Despite the fact that it is a very confounding and problematic source, very tendentious, one fact remains quite clear. The tradition that the founders of the city-states of Novgorod and Kiev also involved men of Scandinavian origin. And now these two terms, which are more or less clear, but there is, let's say, consensus regarding their etymological origin. So first of all, we have the term Rus that was actually used by Finnish communities for Sweden, and it is still used in the form of Ruotsi. And this goes back to an Old Norse word. Rua is to row, and then you also have the noun roður, which would mean rowing or a rowing way, like a route, a river, for example, a route that involves water, a waterway. There's also a theory that the name would have been a little more specific, meaning people of today's area of Roslagen, the coastal area of Swedish Uppland, although that is a bit disputed because at that time, so in the 9th century, Roslagen wouldn't have had such an important role to play in this whole Scandinavian landscape. But then again, the Finns might have named the Swedes after the part of the Swedish realm they knew best. And then the second term would be Varangian or Vairegi in Old Norse. This is most probably derived from a word meaning oath or pledge, guarantee, and it would have meant men of the pledge. So essentially, men engaged in trading enterprises, but then the term evolved to designate the people who were actually in the service of a particular lord. For example, the Varangian guard was serving the emperor at Constantinople. The Baltic Sea was also called More Varavskoye, the Varangian Sea. These terms, and generally speaking, this whole history of Scandinavian presence in Eastern Europe has been in the shadow of political agendas in the course of time, both historical and modern, and these political agendas have significantly shaped the interpretation of available evidence. One of the central issues, if not the central issue, was if these people were the same with the Northmen from Scandinavia. And this debate has persisted for over a century, has been described sometimes as hostile, and it is not really not only a matter of semantics. The separation of East and West in Viking studies is partly due to this debate in particular. People back in the day would have been much more interconnected, but until today, we speak of Vikings in the East and Vikings in the West. At any rate, not all Rus were Vikings, so you have to think of the fact that we are dealing with a very complex historical region with a lot of peoples. So some of the Rus would have been Vikings, a lot of them perhaps, but not all of them. So you have to think a little bit in the context of that period. So understanding identity within a multicultural context with Slavs, Khazars, Byzantines, and Turkish peoples, and many others who resided in that particular area at the time. A significant factor contributing to this whole politicization was the oppressive hold the Soviet Union had on historians and archaeologists in the Eastern European region. For decades during this time, any research suggesting an outside influence, including Scandinavian, having somewhat of a positive impact on the Slavic people was often discouraged or even suppressed. Like I said, the Russian primary chronicle is crucial, albeit problematic, to understand the history of the Rus. This is due to the fact that it was composed between the mid 11th and early 12th century by Christian monks in Kiev, and it provides an origin story for both Russia and Ukraine. There are a couple of controversial aspects. First of all, that the protagonists came from the north and likely they were Swedish Vikings. And secondly, that the Slavonic tribes are somewhat depicted as being incapable of self-rule and of resisting these Varangians. So it is easy to see why such a narrative became a point of contention for national origin stories, leading to the so-called Normanist versus anti-Normanist debate. So Normanist, from Norman, so Northman, argued in favor of a significant role for Scandinavians in the formation of the Kievan state, while anti-Normanists contested this view, wanting to assert a purely Slavic origin. The impact of political ideology on historical interpretation can be further illustrated by an example of a Viking burial found in the castle of Prague. When Nazi Germany occupied Prague in 1939, the Viking identity of the burial was emphasized to support Nazi ideology, stating that Viking, Germanic, or Northmen were all the same. And after the war, under Soviet rule, the interpretation shifted completely to emphasize the Slavic origins. So, such an example can show you how political agendas directly influence the narrative surrounding archaeological discoveries. The primary chronicle, written down several hundred years after the events, was formulated to legitimize the lineage of Rurik and his descendants as the sole legitimate rulers of the Kievan state. And it is because of that we often wonder about its historical accuracy. There have also been attempts to link this Rurik to another one, to the Viking Rorik, who was active in Phrygia. He was the brother or the nephew of the Danish king Harald Klak, but there is really no concrete evidence connecting the two of them, so that is likely a coincidence. Despite the challenges posed by the written sources and these many political sensitivities, new archaeological evidence emerging from the East is beginning to offer ways to corroborate or contradict historical texts. We have sites, for example, like the one in Gniezdovo, rich in Scandinavian cultural artifacts and burial types, which provides tangible evidence of Viking presence in the upper Dnieper region. And we also have quite a recent excavation at the Rus site of Vypozhiv near Kiev, further contributing to the growing body of archaeological data. National narratives, ideological agendas, the limitations of historical sources have created a complex and unfortunately often biased understanding of this period. Let's look a bit at the peoples, because we mentioned before that Rus meant not only Vikings, but all the peoples they came in contact with as well. So it was the result of these many, many contacts. We have in Estland, so Estonia, and around lakes Ladoga and Onega, peoples of Finnish origin or Finno-Ugric origin, the Chuds, for example, mentioned in the primary chronicle, as well as other peoples established around Rostov, the Meria, and Murom, or the Muroma. With them, the Swedes had considerable acquaintance, and at its other southern extremity, we have two great imperial powers, the Byzantine Empire dominating southeastern Europe, and the Black Sea region, as well as the Arab Caliphate with its capital Baghdad in control of the south of the Caucasus. Two very important peoples in this area in the 9th century were the Khazars and the Bulgars. First of these, the Khazars, they were Turkic-speaking peoples, people of Asiatic origin, powerful from the Caucasus and the northern shores of the Caspian through the lands enclosed by the lower Volga and Don. They extended a dominant influence between the Caspian and the southern Urals. The Crimea was also in their hand, and the capital city was at Itil in the Volga Delta, very close to the modern Astrakhan. They had a gift, a propensity for trade and commerce, and their geopolitical role as a buffer against nomadic Turkish tribes such as the Pechenegs made them favored by the Byzantines. So in 834, the Emperor Theophilus sent materials and engineers to construct for them the shining stone fortress of Sarkel, the White House, and thus secure the Don portage and the east-west transit of goods from the Volga mouth to Constantinople. And then west of the Khazars and north of the Byzantines, we have the western division of the Bulgars, a folk often at war with the empire. Modern Bulgaria preserves the names of these early invaders, but the native population was Slavonic and would absorb them completely. Split apart from these by the territories of the Khazars were the other Bulgars of Turkic origin, with a main encampment at Bulgar in the Volga belt. Surprisingly, our first information written down about people from Scandinavia dwelling in the East as well comes from Western sources. We have the Annales Bertiniani, a chronicle that details what happened in the year 839. The chronicles reports that some diplomats arrived at the court of the Frankish Emperor Louis the Pious, Greek ambassadors sent by the Emperor Theophilus of Byzantium. They brought with them a letter and gifts. Louis received them with honor at Ingelheim near Mainz in Germany. They brought with them some men as well. And these men, they said themselves, so states the chronicle, that they were of Rus origin. They also said that their king, and here the chronicler uses the name Kaganus, which is most probably a term borrowed by the Khazars, because Khazars were the ones who had Khans. Um, he was sent in friendship to Theophilus, and Theophilus expressed a wish that Louis would arrange for these people, for these Rus, to continue their journey through his empire. The emperor, so Louis the Pious, was very suspicious, though. He interrogated them more closely, and he found out eventually that they came from Sweden, some region in Sweden. He kept them for a while because he linked them most certainly to the raiding that was happening in the north of the empire, and he was afraid that they were some kind of spies. It is said that they had traveled south to Constantinople on a peaceful mission through the wild tribes dwelling about the Dnieper, and were now returning to a place in Rus, the lands of the Rus, where they had a settlement, some kind of colony, with a leader, and this leader was called a Khan. So the source shows that the eastern routes were very much active at the time, and it also shows that they would have had some form of permanent settlement at the time. Which brings us to Staraya Ladoga. Old Ladoga, a site with certain history in the eastern parts of Scandinavian occupied or explored areas. It is the first of its kind. The site was actually occupied long before people arrived from Sweden, either by a Finnish or a Slavonic community. Its importance stemmed from its geographical position as the starting point for both the route down the Volga towards the Caspian Sea and the Dnieper route leading to the Black Sea. This made it the first truly Eastern settlement showing evidence of Scandinavian input. And there is evidence for a Scandinavian presence from around 750. Extensive evidence of craft work has been found, including a large timber house that might have served as a workshop for craftsmen working with materials such as bronze, antler, or glass. The presence of itinerant craftsmen, such as comb makers, is also noted. Early long-distance trade is evidenced by the discovery of dirhams and imported glass beads. Later finds include carnelian beads and dung beetle-shaped carnelian pendants similar to those found in Birka and near the Caspian Sea, and this would indicate connections both north and south. The early settlement appears to have been peaceful for the first 150 years, with no signs of fortifications and very few weapons found. Written sources also suggest that the Rus had established themselves in these areas by the beginning of the 9th century, which aligns with the archaeological evidence. And we can also draw an Arabic source here in Rusta's description. He describes an island with a lake as a center for the Rus. This might refer to Staraya Ladoga or the area around Lake Ilmen. There is a later fortification around the same time as the establishment of the heavily fortified settlement of Rurikovo Gorodische. Staraya Ladoga also became fortified, and this would suggest a shift from a purely peaceful and trading environment to somewhat of a more violent one. Many burial mounds in the Ladoga Onega area have been discovered along the rivers Volkhov, Pasa, Oyat, and Svir. The 400 or so of these which have been examined speak of Finnish and Swedish traders and colonizers. What can also be noticed is that the majority of these visitors would not stay long in town. Some would acquire land outside it to raise stock or crops, but most would actually go further. They were not farmers. The suspicion is that most of them would have been merchants, and as I already specified, from Aldejuborg, the Old Norse name for Straja Doga, there would have been quite a vast choice of routes to the rivers of Dnieper and Volga, which were the trade arteries in the land of the Rus. So to reach the Dnieper, merchants would journey south along the river Volkhov to the town of Novgorod by Lake Ilmen, traverse the lake and continue south along the river Lovat, and eventually, by the use of smaller streams and a short and manageable portage, reach the headwaters of the Dnieper, and it was possible to make much the same connection by way of the Gulf of Riga and the southern Dvina. In the Volga direction, a couple of possibilities as well, from Lake Ladoga by the river Sias, then by portage and the Mologa to the Volga north of Rostov, the other from Lake Ladoga by the river Svir to Lake Onega, and from there upstream to Lake Beloya, on whose southern shore stood another trading town, Belozero. That would have been the patrimony of the brother of Rurik we saw before in the Russian primary chronicle by the name of Sineus. So you don't need to remember these names, just the fact that Staraya Ladoga had a very profound strategic implication for those traveling in these areas. By the closing decades of the 9th century, the Swedes and the Rus were of considerable importance in these lands. On the Volga, they were active in trade and in contact with the Khaganates of the Bulgars and Khazars, and they were also known to the Muslims south of the Caspian. Arabian silver, Persian glass, Chinese silk, narrow-necked bronze bottles from the east of the Caspian, exotic purses from India, spices and wines, all these found their way to Novgorod, to Gotland, and the homes and graves of Swedish Uppland, in exchange for slaves, weapons, honey, wax, and furs. Obtaining and selling slaves was a significantly profitable part of the Rus operation. It was actually so successful that the very name of the people captured, the Slavs, is identified as the origin of the word slave. Enslavement was also seasonal, with raids into the hinterland to capture people who were then sold along the Volga and the Dnieper rivers in markets to the south and the north. Settlements like Vipojiv likely served as holding areas for slaves for weeks or months, drawing a parallel to Western Viking camps. High demand for slaves in the Islamic Caliphate in the 9th century, which drove prices up significantly, made it quite a popular business venture for the Rus. And the second noteworthy thing they sold were the furs. Furs from the north. They were considered luxury items among the elite in Baghdad. They were similar to how beads and other exotic objects were luxuries in the north. Some furs might have originated in Scandinavia, but many would have been acquired throughout Eastern Europe by those traveling the rivers. Different regions would have offered specialized furs, such as the highly desirable white winter coats of stoats from the Finns. Various fur types were used for different purposes, could only be obtained at specific times of the year. Al-Masudi, for example, another Arabic writer, explains that the furs were traded from the Volga region south of the Islamic Caliphate and north and west to Francia and Al-Andalus, so Muslim Iberia. The rulers of non-Arab peoples highly valued these furs, particularly the prized black furs, which were used for garments like sleeveless tunics and bonnets. Along the rivers, they won a footing at Gnezdovo Smolensk, at Chernihiv. They eventually gained supremacy at Kiev, from which they last exploited and imposed their will on the surrounding Slav population. So before the end of the century, Kiev, under the rulership of Oleg, would be the main seat of Rus power. With regard to the settlements, we can say that these areas were often controlled by a warrior elite, or at least this is what the archaeological landscape as well as the written sources suggest. This would contrast a bit with earlier times that might have been characterized by more peaceful trading, but weapons and military equipment are among the most commonly found artifact types with clear Scandinavian origins or forms in the East. This would suggest a strong military presence and influence in the Rus territory. A direct parallel could be drawn with the military garrison at Birka in Sweden, which fully emerged in the 10th century. The garrison area contained buildings and graves with extensive weaponry. The presence of a central hall with hundreds of knives and weapons stored within further indicates that the stronghold was home to a militarized unit. Interestingly, we also have evidence of Eastern fighters, specifically Magyars, among the graves at Birka. The discovery of archer equipment associated with the Magyars suggests either the presence of migrant archers or deeper contacts between the two regions, likely facilitated by the Rus. So this would again reinforce the idea of the Rus territories as crossroads and points of contact between very different cultures and military traditions. The existence of what appears to be a professional and organized military entity within these settlements implies that their role was to defend and support a ruler or a ruling elite, to maintain order and ensure that trade could continue as desired by the ruling group. In the Russian primary chronicle, we also encounter the term of druzhina, an elite retinue surrounding a leader, mentioned multiple times in connection with Rus princes collecting tribute or engaging in warfare. High status warrior graves found in the Desna region are thought to have belonged to members of such a druzhina, potentially linked to the Kievan princes descended from Rurik, but there were likely many more important individuals than those recorded in our written sources. The importance of allegiance to a ruler is highlighted by the custom of inserting a marker post into a chieftain's burial mound inscribed with the names of both the deceased and the king. The lack of written records detailing the political organization of these groups in the early 9th century suggests that perhaps other clues might come from neighboring sources, such as the Byzantine Empire. And in fact, the establishment of the Climata province in Crimea in 839 by Emperor Theophilus with a permanent military garrison is interpreted as a strategic move in response to a potential threat from rivals like the Magyars, the Khazars, and also potentially an emerging Rus state. Similarly, the Khazars' request for Byzantine help in fortifying the city of Sarkel in the same year also indicates concerns about the growing power of the Rus. The fact that a group was led by someone referred to as a Khagan, as we saw earlier, a Khazar title for a ruler, indicates the establishment of a significant political entity with a military component by more or less 830. The possibility of internal conflict between different Rus groups is also present, potentially explaining the evidence of repeated burning at sites like Vyborzew. The political landscape of the Rus might have actually resembled quite a lot that of Scandinavia at the time, with a series of local chieftains or petty kings holding sway. The idea is also supported by the numerous individuals described as envoys or their representatives in the 10th century treaties between Byzantium and the Rus, some of whom might have been semi-independent rulers or landowners rather than just the members of a particular Kievan prince's drushina. The Arabic sources are very important for us to reconstruct what was going on at the time. One of them is Ibn Rustah. He wrote in the first half of the 10th century, and he tells us how the Rus lived on an island in a lake, which was large, marshy, forested, and also unhealthy. The Staraya Ladoga, probably. They were busy with slave hunting, he says, and he also says that they have no cultivated land but depend on their living on what they can obtain from the land of the Sakaliba, Sagaliba being the Arabic term used for Slavs. He says that they have no estates, villages, or fields. Their only business is dealing in squirrel and other furs. Now, he might have exaggerated a bit, but that it depends which of the Rus, whom of the Rus he actually encountered. He also speaks of them as being valiant and treacherous at the same time, handsome, clean, well dressed. He also notices the baggy trousers, as well as the tapestries, some of which might have been influenced by Oriental fashions. He also mentions that they were hospitable and protective of their guests, but also quarrelsome among themselves and frequently resorting to single combat to sort out a conflict, which is very much reminiscent of what the Icelandic sagas tell us about the Holmgang, the single duel. In the face of a common enemy, however, they can close up their ranks and fight as one man. He also says that they had some sort of priests and made sacrifices, and when one of their chieftains died, they made a grave, like a big house, and put him inside with all his objects and gold armbands as well, an abundance of food, vessels with drink, and coins. We do have examples of wooden burial chambers at Gniezdovo, Chernichov, and Kiev on the Dnieper. This seems to corroborate what Ibn is telling us. Many are actually of Swedish provenance, including some of them containing both women and men, sometimes also a horse, in addition to other grave goods. And on the Dnieper, it is also noteworthy that women are almost never wearing Scandinavian brooches, or at least these are not to be found in the graves. So the presumption here would be that they married local women. Another vital source for the presence of the Northmen in Eastern Europe is Ibn Fadlan, little more famous. He described the Rus as being perfectly, from a physical standpoint, tall and ruddy, with green tattoos of trees and figures covering their bodies from their necks to their fingertips. He was also shocked and horrified by some of their customs, by their lack of hygiene. In particular, he observed that they did not wash after going to the toilet, after eating, or even after sexual intercourse. He also described a morning washing ritual where a servant provides a bowl of dirty water in which the master washes his hair, blows his nose, spits, and does other filthy things unimaginable, he says, after which the bowl is passed on to others. And this is why he classifies them as donkeys in this regard. He also notes their practice of making offerings of bread, meat, onions, and milk to idols upon arriving at the trading camp. And they believed that the idols represented a god who would ensure good deals. He obviously found this belief foolish. He was, like I said, outraged by their sexual practices. He found it to be in stark opposition with what was preached in the Muslim context, and he also describes how men wore torques of gold and silver. He says that every man, upon accumulating 10,000 dirhams, he might have exaggerated here, but the simple fact is important. So when acquiring this fortune, the men would have made talks for their wives, and this would increase with their wealth. So a woman could have a lot of talks. This is an interesting observation because it demonstrates that silver was used as a portable currency and a visible indicator of wealth. So you wore your silver, you wore your wealth on your neck. Ibn Fadlan is, however, most famous for his eyewitness account of the burial of a chieftain he notices near the Volga, and he has quite a detailed description of it, a description that includes the preparation of the body, the construction of a burial chamber on the ship, animal sacrifices, very bloody, and the ritualized killing of a slave girl to accompany her master in death. The account is a crucial link between the Rus and other peoples from Scandinavia, which we might consider Vikings or the Norse, a more general term. However, we also need to remember that what he notices is just a ritual performed here in Eastern Europe by this particular group of people. So we shouldn't draw the general conclusion that everyone was doing that throughout the Norse world. Ibn Fadlan also mentions using an interpreter during his journey, and that implies that there was a language barrier between him and the Rus. So He also notes that the interpreter translated not only the language but also the customs, which raises a question mark on the reliability of his account. He observed that the Rus camping by the Volga River in the boats for trade included men, women, children, and countless slaves, most of them for sale. So definitely, this would suggest the significant trading network along the rivers the Rus were involved in. The Arabs were not the only ones writing about the presence of the Rus. We also have interesting Byzantine sources, sometimes with different information or even contradictory information. One of the main Byzantine sources is Constantinos Porphyrogenitus, the emperor, who has a work called the Administrando Imperio, so how to how to rule an empire. He wrote it about in about 950. And he was concerned about some particular aspects. He was concerned to tell of the convoys of vessels out of the Russian north, which descend the Dnieper to Berezan on the Black Sea, and from there make their way to the imperial city itself. The boats from further Russia, he tells us, come from Novgorod, where Prince Sviatoslav had his seat, the son of the Igor who attacked Constantinople in 941. He also mentions other places these people came from, such as Smolensk, Chernihiv, Teliutsa, and how they traveled downstream. He mentions the fact that by June the Dnieper was navigable and they faced a lot of dangers. There were two main dangers: the natural hazards of the descent, which were which were worst at the rapids of which were the worst at the rapids, and then you also had the risk of ambush by pechenegs. So if you stopped, for example, to disassemble the boat and carry it a little bit on land, you would have had to be very, very careful because the pechenegs did, well, very much the same thing Vikings used to do, which was raiding. And we do have quite a horrible episode about that. It's about the Prince Sviatoslav himself, who in 972 was slain by the pechenegs, and they made a drinking cup of his skull. He also mentions cataracts of the Dnieper, and he says that they needed to find a way to get past these. And what is most interesting is that he notes the Old Norse names of these cataracts. So again, one piece of evidence that the people we're dealing with were actually of Norse origin. So we have, for example, the drinker or the gulper or the island force, the yeller, the ever noisy, and so on. So Esupi, Gulper, Ulvorsi, Gelandri, Ivor, and so on and so forth. So these are all Old Norse terms. Among other things, he also mentions people who paid tribute to the Rus, and most of them are actually Slavonic, Veruvians, Severians, Dregovicians, all kinds of names for Slavic communities. Last but not least, he tells us that they come to the island of St. Gregor with its giant oak to perform a sacrifice there, and then to Berezan on the Black Sea. That could be some sort of remembrance of Birka, the birch island in Lake Mälaren in Sweden. And on this island, in particular, we can actually find a runestone, one of the very few runestones in Eastern Europe, and it is a runestone where an unknown Norseman called Grani cut runes in memory of his unknown comrade Karl, who fell in Eastern Europe. The relationship with the Byzantines is also one very interesting one. For example, by a treaty of 945, the emperor would make it clear he did not propose to see this island in the Black Sea become a base. So he requested the Rus to go back home every autumn, and at the same time, the Byzantines tried to maintain trading relationships with them. So the Rus were essentially welcome. They were even favored at times when it suited politically the emperor to have a strong state at Kiev, well, strong enough to retain local tribes, but not strong enough to challenge the empire itself with expectation of success. This was not always the case. In the early 860s, a fleet is said to have been under the command of Askold and Dir, also mentioned in the Russian primary chronicle. These would have uh, ravaged the shores of the Black Sea and appeared in Constantinople in the absence of the emperor. Uh, it is also told, but here you can definitely see a sign of propaganda. It is also told that they were not driven off by the forces of the city, but by the prayers to the Virgin and the destructive storm that followed, taken as a punishment. Then in 907, the Rus were back again, this time under Oleg, the uniter of Novgorod and Kiev, a fleet of 2,000 vessels. That is most likely exaggerated, and a stratagem which circumvented the chaining of the Bosphorus by putting the ships on wheels and sailing them overland to Constantinople. At any rate, a treaty is sealed in 911, and the treaty also shows the fragmentation of this world of the Rus, because we have a bunch of names here: Karli, Ingeld, Vermut, Ruald, Khan, Frelaf, and so on. These are all sent by Oleg and by the illustrious and mighty princes to the emperors Leo II, Leo the Sixth, sorry, and also Alexander and Constantine. Alexander and Constantine being the co-emperors, and the treaty would state that the main purpose of it would be maintaining a long-lasting friendship between Greeks and Rus. Earlier, there have been also mentions of free bathing and provisions and ship's gear, and these would have been reminiscent of the deals and treaties far west in the Frankish Empire. There was now peace for 30 years since till Prince Igor came across the Black Sea in the early summer of 941 with a fleet said to have consisted of 10,000 ships. Again, we have to be careful with these numbers. They're much overestimated. Whatever the number, they availed him nothing, because he and his army were destroyed by outpourings of Greek fire. So he became very vengeful after this, and he actually returned 3 years later with a horde of mercenaries. However, this time there was no need for Greek fire, because diplomacy was just as effective. He was essentially bought with gifts and promises. His Pechenik allies departed with everyone's blessing to ravage other territories, such as those of the Bulgars, and that Igor led the Rus back home to Kiev. So we're back to this treaty I mentioned earlier, the treaty in 945. According to the treaty, summer quarters were allotted to the Varangians in the suburbs of Constantinople, but they may not enter the city proper in detachments of more than 50 men, and they would have needed to be unarmed. The amount of silk they could have purchased should not exceed the worth of 50 gold pieces, and this required a stamp before it left the city. This was a way of precaution against the local black market. The Rus were also entitled to provisions, to food, equipment for their return to Kiev, which must take place every autumn, like I said, and finally they would fight the Bulgars and entreat the Khazars. There is quite compelling evidence of Viking presence in Miklagard, the great city, as they called Constantinople, in Hagia Sophia, which is now a mosque, but it used to be a church. We have a runic graffiti, most certainly an inscription with the name of Halfdan, and possibly another shorter one, another short name, maybe Arni or something of the sort. So at any rate, somebody wanted to be remembered for having traveled to the great city. The popularity of the journey to Miklagard by the end of the Viking Age is also underscored by the fact that special laws were imposed in Scandinavia to govern the management of wealth left behind by those who traveled here. For instance, the Norwegian Gulathing law code stipulated that the wealth should be immediately given to successors if the owner went to Byzantium, and that contrasted with the 3-year waiting period for other destinations. The crucial role of Scandinavians in Byzantine affairs is also underscored by the fact that they formed the majority of the so-called Varangian Guard, the specialist mercenary unit founded in the late 10th century to serve as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperors. This was instituted following a request for help from Emperor Basil II to Vladimir of Kiev in 987. In essence, Constantinople, we can conclude, was a critical destination for the Rus because it offered a lot of opportunity for trade, but also for diplomacy as well as military service. Now let's go a little bit to the Caspian region. There were several potential routes from the Black Sea region to the Caspian. You could travel via the Don River eastwards from the mouth of the Dnieper into the Sea of Azov, then following the River Don to the Khazar city of Sarkel, or from Sarkel one could connect to the Volga River or travel overland to Itil. Itil was the Khazar capital on the Caspian Sea. You could also travel overland through Georgia, coming ashore in the eastern part of the Black Sea, and then proceeding towards the Caspian. At any rate, upon reaching the shores of the Caspian, travelers would have entered Khazar territory, and this necessitated maintaining diplomatic relationships with the Khazar Khaganate. The Arab historian al-Masudi noted the presence of both pagans, including Rus and Slavs, living in a designated area of Itil, the Khazar capital. He also mentioned that both groups served in the Khazar ruler's army, and this would have been similar to the situation in Constantinople. Initial interactions might have been peaceful. There was a relatively quick transition to raiding as well, however. The first reported attack targeted the port town of Abaskun on the southeastern shore of the Caspian Sea, but this was unsuccessful. Al-Masudi also describes a massive attack on multiple territories around the Caspian a few years later. This would have involved 500 ships, each carrying 100 warriors who raided cities along the southern shore, including modern-day Azerbaijan. The account highlights the unexpected nature of these attacks for the local populations who, well, they were not that accustomed to seaborne enemies. The success is attributed to the Rus boats and maritime skills. However, we also have large Muslim forces who are perfectly capable of defeating the Rus near the Volga. And then one attack is recorded on the city of Barda in Azerbaijan in 943. The historian Ibn Miskalawaya provides a detailed account of a deliberate attack on this particular town. It was more than a raid. It appears that they intended to actually use it as a raiding base in the future, or even as a permanent settlement due to its trade links. The forces of the Rus initially defeated the local defenders and occupied the town, but they eventually retreated after facing internal issues as well as local resistance. By the 11th century, that would be the time of Ingvar, the far travels expedition. Ingvar, I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. The flow of silver to the north and west had begun to decline, and this would have led to fewer traders venturing east. The Norse term Serkland also appears on some runestones, and it might have referred to the Islamic Caliphate, could have been connected to the region south of the Caspian Sea, or perhaps even to the city of Sarkel itself. The Caspian Sea was significant due to its connections to established trade networks, including the Silk Roads, offering access to valuable commodities and further routes east towards Baghdad and beyond. Some individuals might have actually traveled overland to Baghdad, a vital hub on the Silk Roads, although such journeys were likely rare. So, all in all, a period of significant, often violent interaction between the Rus and the Caspian region, driven by opportunities for trade and increasingly raiding. The Khazar Khaganate plays a crucial role in this story by controlling access to the area, and the Rus exploits demonstrate their adaptability as well as maritime capabilities in navigating these rivers, these eastern routes. When in 943 the Rus fleet entered the river Kura south of Baku and reached the town of Barda, this was happening in the time of Igor. Igor's son Sviatoslav, the legend has it that he was born when his mother was 60, was a hardy campaigner against Khazars as well as Bulgars, and shortly before the Pechenegs took his head, quite literally, he had behaved menacingly towards Constantinople as well. Sviatoslav is interesting to see this evolution of identity. He does not have a Norse name, and it is not the only point of departure from his Viking heritage. It is told that his head was shaven except for a lock of hair on one side as a sign of the nobility of his clan. We have this particular detail from the Chronicle of Leo the Deacon, who also tells us that his neck was thick, his shoulders broad, his whole stature pretty fine. He seemed gloomy and savage, and on one of his ears hung a golden earring adorned with two pearls and a ruby set between them. War ensues among his sons, and the third son, Vladimir, is the one who wins with the help of an army recruited, we are told, in Sweden. He also interferes victoriously in the affairs of Slavonic tribes. He makes his presence felt in the north among the people from Estland and their neighbors. He also beats the Poles and the Bulgars and even the Pechenegs. One very important event linked to Vladimir is when he accepted Christianity in 988. The Christianity of the Greek Church. He helps the Emperor Basil II Bulgaroctonos put down a rebellion by Bardas Phokas and is rewarded with the emperor's sister in marriage. So you can see that we are dealing with a change, even a long-lasting change in terms of religious and political allegiances here. And then we have Yaroslav, who, like Sviatoslav, was a man of vision, and he had an awareness of what was needed to strengthen the kingdom of Novgorod Kiev and enhance its prestige in the eyes of its neighbors. He was highly conscious of his Scandinavian connection. He married Ingerd, the daughter of Olaf Hötkonung of Sweden, and he also comforted and reinforced the dispossessed Olaf Haraldsson of Norway. He gave refuge to Magnus Olafsson, as well as the more famous Harald Hardrada, the one who would attack England in 1066. When in the 1030s he had ground down the Pechenegs, he celebrated the victory and the god who gave it by building the first cathedral of the Rus, the church of Hagia Sophia. So a new Sophia that would have emulated a little bit the one in Constantinople. He asserted the Kievan power with similar success in the northern reaches of his vast dominion. He also brought peoples such as the Chuds under control and enlarged his boundaries to the west. So there has been a steady process of assimilation to the native population, generally speaking, for almost 200 years. We have intermarriage, we have change of language and religion, we have the adoption of different customs, many of Slavonic origin, and all of this would have quietly eroded the northerness of the Rus. And adding to this is also the massive influence of Byzantium. The Eastern history is not marginal to the Viking world. On the contrary, everything is very much interconnected. However, there are some changes occurring. Like I said, one empathic break can be noticed during the time of Vladimir, his conversion to Eastern Christianity, while Sweden, for example, was still heathen, together with the adoption of the Slavic tongue. And all of this was accompanied by an extraordinary decline in the import of Muslim silver into Scandinavia. The reasons for that were different, the depletion of mines in Afghanistan, for example, as well as political infighting in the Abbasid Empire. This was indeed already marked in the time of Sviatoslav and has been ascribed to the interruption of Volga trade as a result of that king's warring against the Bulgars as well. At the same time, we can notice that Birka, for example, ceases to be a very important town in terms of trading and commerce, and this suggests that it was a town very much dependent on Russian trade. increasingly the Rus looked first to themselves and then to Byzantium, and there was an ongoing growing gap between Sweden, Svithjod in Old Norse, and what is deemed to be the great territory of the Swedes, Svithjod Hinmikla, a term we find in the Old Norse sources suggesting the expansion of Norsemen essentially coming from Sweden to the east. However, at times we do have contingents, even small armies, enlisted to do battle against the emperor's enemies. There is fair documentation of the presence, the lasting presence of the Northmen at the court of Constantinople. We also have mentions that they landed in Crete, for example, and also southern Italy. They also fought in Dalmatia, in Mesopotamia, and yeah, they traveled and fought a lot. It was quite a rewarding job, one might say. The Rus would remain in the imperial service till the early 30th century, but after 1066, the composition was much changed. Yeah, actually, ironically, a lot of people from England came to the Varangian Guard after this particular date, so after the Norman conquest. There are a couple of runestones, very interesting ones, witness to this whole evolution. There is one, for example, in Uppland, stating that Rogvald had carved runes for his mother, and God help her soul. But then, so one thing about the runestones, they were commemorative, so you often used them to remember your dead relatives, but they were also a great opportunity to boast a bit about yourself. And this was exactly what Rogval is doing, because after mentioning his mother who died, he says that he was in Greekland, so the Byzantine Empire, and he was the leader of a host, so perhaps even the Varangian Guard or something similar to it. Then there's also one mentioning Serkland from Södermanland, also Sweden. Tola had the stone raised for his son Harald, Ingvar's brother. They journeyed far afield after gold. In the east, they gave food to eagles, so that's metaphorically said that they died, and they died in the south in Serkland. And this Ingvar is the one the lecture started with, Ingvar the Far-Travelled, whose exploits in the East would be the topic of the stuff for legends in the Icelandic sagas in the 30th century. So the memory of these journeys in the East would have been still very much alive after all this time. In Venice, down past the Riva degli Schiavoni and outside the entrance to the arsenal, you are going to see 4 guarding lions. The bigger of the two, brought from Piraeus, from Athens, displays worn runic signs inscribed there, again, most likely by soldiers in the Byzantine Empire in the second half of the 11th century. So we can't really be sure what is written here. The runes are very weathered, but again, this is a sign of the activities of these people in Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire, and how much they wanted to be remembered for their exploits. So to sum it up, why these journeys to the east are important? Well, we can conclude a crucial role of the eastward connections and trade in shaping Viking society and their interactions across Europe. In many Western graves, for example, you're going to find objects that stem from the east, such as beads and also glass and high status objects, exotic objects that came through these routes all the way to Francia and to England. So we can definitely talk about a global reach here. Scandinavians, they skillfully tapped into pre-existing trade routes like the Silk Roads or the steppe roads before them in Eastern Europe, and they managed very well to combine their two main activities of raiding and trading. One very important aspect is that of a mixed identity and cultural exchange happening here, as we have already seen. They came in contact with a lot of peoples in Eastern Europe, and they contributed to creating a society here, but that contribution cannot be understood without taking into account these many contacts they had with the peoples they met. They managed to do so because they had very good maritime skills, and they used them to become kings on the rivers as well. So definitely an important role played in this whole story is their ability to control the rivers as arteries of communication and travel and trade as well. We also have noticed that the settlements would have been disparate at the beginning, fragmentary, petty even, but then we can notice a gradual evolution towards a more centralized structure, and this structure is the one that would, in the end, create the state of the Kievan Rus. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I actually have a video I made on the runes that you can read on the Piraeus lion. And if you haven't checked the other presentation about Vikings traveling in the North Atlantic, feel free to check it out later. So I hope you found out a lot of interesting things from this presentation, and my apologies again for my terrible voice you had to put up with. Um, However, I do hope that you enjoyed it at least a bit.
Thank you so much, Irina. The presentation was wonderful as always. And thank you for everyone watching. You can scan the QR code on the right side of your screen to check out Irina's YouTube channel, and on the left side of your screen to donate to SASA. Our birthday bash is also starting on the 5th of April, and we have a panel discussion on the future of the past scheduled on that day. So please check out the lineup. And thank you again, and we'll be back with more masterclasses.
Thank you so much once again. And if you have questions or comments, please redirect them to my YouTube channel. Thank you.